Good morning, everyone, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to Capital Without Borders, the new podcast brought to you by Interpolitan Money. We're discussing how money really moves across the world and why global finance is often far more complicated than it seems. Interpolitan Money's mission is to power the movement of capital across borders for the world's most sophisticated clients. And here at Capital Without Borders, we're speaking to our global network of like-minded partners who are united in that mission. My name is Kate Edwards, and I'll be your host. You can listen to us on Spotify or you can watch us on YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe and follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram at Interpolitan Money for updates. If you'd like to find out more about how Interpolitan Money can help you or your business, please email us at partnerships@interpolitanmoney.com. Now, on today's episode, we are joined by John Russo, who is the Managing Director of LS Private, which is a subsidiary of Lawrence Stevens. They are a multifamily office that delivers tailored advice, governance and execution services for ultra-high net worth families, founders and individuals. Hi, John. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We're so happy to have you on. Would you mind starting us off by just introducing yourself and what you do and a little bit about your background?
Sure. Well, my name's John Russo. I'm the Managing Director of LS Private, which is a multifamily office, which is designed to help individuals and entrepreneurs who are navigating complex ecosystems of wealth and legal requirements, financial requirements, and political requirements. I've been in the family office sector for the last 12 years, having exclusively run and created single family offices for some of the most notable wealthy UK individuals at a billionaire status. So I've taken that experience now and helping people in the vicinity of anywhere from 100 to 250 million is kind of our sweet spot, but we also help a few clients who are around the multi-billion level as well.
So kicking off with discussing kind of the evolution of the multifamily office model, multifamily offices are moving from service providers to strategic control centers. How would you define the modern MFO in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the old family office was traditionally a service platform. So the 2026 or the modern family office is more of a control tower. You know, we're a central point of communication and coordination for various matters, whether they're legal, whether they're financial, whether they're personal, political, and not just in one jurisdiction, across multiple jurisdictions, whether it's in the Middle East or the UK and Europe or North America or Asia. And it's no longer a concierge service. You know, it's essentially, it's an OS system. It's an operating system for complex matters. And, you know, I think if you look at the older family office models, maybe 10, 15 years ago, they wanted access and convenience and introductions. But now it's more about architecture and coordination. The best way to look at it from a multifamily office perspective is that they're not there to create more activity. They create accountability, a system of order into a disciplined execution where everything's sort of through one central point of communication coordination. So the family feel like they can either concentrate on generating more wealth or enjoying their wealth.
So you describe acting as a single point of accountability. Why is that becoming non-negotiable for global families today?
I think it's becoming non-negotiable that there's a central point of accountability because historically, families and ultra-high net worth individuals have been too polite in allowing fragmentation to occur. And you know, the funny thing is, most wealthy people don't suffer from a lack of advisors. You know, everyone's coming out of the woodwork, whether it's a one-stop shop or it's a proper prestigious firm or someone with a proven experience in advising clients. But a single point of accountability matters because it sees the whole chessboard at once. And somebody has to know what was agreed and what's outstanding, what's responsible, what the risk is, what happens next. Families are now appreciating that more. They're no longer impressed by going to a boardroom and sitting with 50 advisors around them. They don't just want someone who's giving opinions. They want someone who's governing and shepherding and owning outcomes. That's why I think it's becoming a non-negotiable.
So talking about governance for a minute, governance used to be a back office concern and now it's front and center. Why do you think that is for ultra high net worth families?
I think it stops private wealth becoming private chaos. You know, I mean, for years, governance has been treated as something dry and procedural. It is, it's administrative. But families that I've worked with over the years and recently are learning that often expensively as well. Often expensively, governance is not bureaucracy, it's protection. It protects capital, it protects relationships, it protects the decision-making process, and it protects reputation. And the larger a family becomes, the more likely that poor governance will eventually highlight very serious problems. So when things go wrong, they really fail because of a lack of wealth. They fail because of a lack of transparency or clarity. That's where things go wrong. So governance is really clarity formalized. And that's
Yeah.
why I think it's becoming more centralized, especially as families grow in size and population.
And how do you then balance formal governance, trusts, boards, charters with the human dynamics of the families?
You balance it by remembering that governance is there to support relationships, not replace them. Proximity to power and wealth can delude some advisors into thinking they're entitled to it. I live a relatively extraordinary life with who I advise, but that proximity to that doesn't entitle me to any of it. And I think the mistake that people often make in the advisory role is they're treating family governance like corporate governance with private jets or better wine or however you want to do it. It's not. Families are they're emotional systems before they're legal systems. So the documents matter when you're creating the infrastructure, but I think there's an EQ element that matters as well, because no matter all the governance in the world can't save a family from conversations it's frightened or unwilling to have. So the best government frameworks are technically sound but psychologically intelligent, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And speaking about kind of cross-border complexity and legal architecture, you have worked extensively across different jurisdictions. What has changed in cross-border structuring over the past kind of 5 years?
The biggest change to cross-border structuring, I think, is I would actually say that the conversations I have now are moved away from optimism to defensibility. 5 or 10 years ago, families might ask, what's the most effective structure? And now the better question is, what structure makes sense when examined from every angle? So you've got the multiple pillars. You've got the legal, tax, operational, reputational, regulatory. Um, so even if a structure is too complicated to explain clearly, or too artificial to operate properly, or too dependent on assumptions, it's not as sophisticated as it might hope. So in cross-border structuring, defensibility and elegance, simplicity matters more than being clever. But yeah, I think it's moved from being more optimistic to more defensible.
And are you finding that families are generally becoming more geographically diverse about where they live, invest, and hold assets?
I think families are becoming more geographically diverse, but I think they're being more intentional about it. They're no longer thinking of a single home with a few satellite bases. They're thinking in layers, like where does the family live, where the children may study, where capital is deployed. Some families, especially now with what's happening in the Middle East and, the general oil crisis, big focus, which I probably might not have seen as obvious years ago, is debating, discussing where optionality sits if the world changes. I mean, essentially that means that residence, asset location, control towers, they're increasingly separated, and the family may live in one place and operate through another, invest in various outfits, and hold strategic relationships across over them. So I don't think families are simply global, but they're becoming more structural across multiple jurisdictions.
And are those global families becoming more or less tolerant of complex offshore structures, given kind of recent regulatory scrutiny?
I think families are becoming less tolerant of complexity for its own sake, but they're still very interested in robust international structuring when there's a genuine reason to it. Families still understand that international structures can serve legitimate purposes: succession, asset protection, governance, regulatory alignment, cross-border asset holding. But today, families want to answer, why does this structure exist? Who controls it? Can we defend it calmly if anyone's serious asks about it, like the tax man? I think the age of opaque complexity is dying, but the age of explainable structure is maybe where we're heading into now, as families are becoming less tolerant of just complex for the sake of complexity.
And what would you say are the biggest risks that families are then seeing when they're operating globally that they need to be aware of?
Well, I think it's just aligning your tax and your legal and your financial obligations. Getting correct local advice on that realignment is critical. And getting best in class advice. I mean, the biggest risk right now is creating tax burdens in the various jurisdictions that you're operating or generating wealth in, because I think governments are getting more aggressive about wanting to ensure that they're getting their share of any profits achieved or any income being raised. So that is number one with a bullet, making sure that the advice isn't just to that jurisdiction. The advice is cross-jurisdictional. So you've got advisors in the UK speaking with your advisors in Guernsey, speaking with your advisors in the Middle East to ensure there's alignment. Because ultimately, if something goes wrong, it's the family's consequence, not the advisors.
So moving on to legal and reputational risk, how do you build structures that are not only resilient financially, but legally and crucially reputationally?
How do you build structures that are resilient, not just financially, but legally and reputationally? I think the answer to that question is you build them on the assumption that one day you're going to have to justify or explain them, and most likely under some pressure to justify and explain them. A resilient structure is not just efficient when everyone is calm. It's got to be coherent when the regulators ask questions, when counterparties fall apart, when journalists become interested. That's a big one. When family relationships fracture is probably the biggest one. Or when the next generation, and I deal a lot with this, when the next generation is challenging some of the older, more antiquated decisions. So, I think if a structure only works in private, it's not a robust structure. Can it survive scrutiny? Can it survive a bit of pressure? Financial resilience matters, of course, but the legal and the reputational stuff comes from consistency, what the structure says, what it does, and ultimately what the founders, the family, intended it to be for. But it's that scrutiny, that pressure cooker, because it will come up, and it might come up in a small way. It might come up with just one jurisdiction's tax governance questioning a few of the motives, but it might come even, more substantial into COP 8 and COP 9 tax inquiries that we'd have here in the UK.
Yeah. And what role then does legal proactivity have to play instead of kind of firefighting?
Reactive legal work is expensive. It's distracting, it's emotional, it's generally unpleasant, when it's reactive. Proactive strategy is probably one of the highest return disciplines in private wealth, precisely because it prevents a crisis from becoming a narrative. Um, I think the best legal strategy is never dramatic. It's systematic. It starts by asking a few uncomfortable questions. It tightens documents before they get there's an inquisition. Firefighting will always exist, and it's probably one of the things that keeps me so busy. But most lawyers would argue that you end up being ambulance chasing. It's sort of triage. It's an emergent situation. Whereas if you're proactive, then it's more urban planning. And laying out the groundwork. So I always think that one of the things we do through the firm that I work with is we have a proactive approach just to test the robustness of all the various material to make sure that there isn't a genuine risk, or at least the family knows about the risk in the years to come.
And is there any patterns that you've noticed or that you could share in terms of when risk emerges?
I think risk usually emerges genuinely because of an event that's occurred. Someone phrased this to me the other day. It's usually like a single dramatic event that's occurred. And I'd take it one step back. I think risk comes from, yes, something's happened that might be dramatic. But I think if you go one step back, it's because there was a tolerated ambiguity regarding, oh, well, we're not sure, but it's not that important right now. And that could come from anything from decisions not being documented correctly to structures not being reviewed and not reflecting the reality of the family situation. And then something happens, there's an event that gets triggered, whether it's a death or a divorce or a liquidity event. And then I think the thing I remember saying to a family once, a problem hasn't been created, it's being revealed by what's happened. And so in family offices, crises don't usually come out of nowhere. They come out of things everyone generally agreed, though it might have been unspoken, just not to address or tidy up.
And discussing now the fragmentation problem and advisors and silos, one of the issues that you have highlighted is advisors are often being pulled in different directions. So why do you find that is still such a persistent problem?
I think the problem isn't that there are bad advisors. The problem is that there are good advisors without a conductor. That's essentially what a family office leader will be doing. They're conducting the orchestra. And so professionally, I refer to it as a single point of coordination and communication for the family. The lawyers want the legal integrity, the tax advisors want efficiency, the investment advisor wants performance, the trustee wants defensibility. And individually, they're right, but wrong collectively because they might be pulling in different directions. And the family will experience that as friction, advisors fighting for status. They'll experience that as delay. They'll experience that as contradiction. And that's why there needs to be someone formally, and the larger family offices usually hire this internally. I think if you're at unless you're wanting to run a lean family office, if you're under $1 billion, you can use a multi-family office to do this, where they are the conductor for this orchestra of advisors across not just one jurisdiction, but sometimes multiple jurisdictions. And I think advisors aren't used to integration at that level, because it's about who owns the matter, especially when most of those advisors are based on performance or a transactional hourly fee relationship.
And how do you then, as the multifamily office, manage the conflict between the multiple advisors?
Well, I think that it's not, I wouldn't couch it as a conflict, maybe. I'd say that they're just not in alignment. They're all playing different tunes. And making sure that you're getting everyone together for discussions without them making a meal out of it for the family and being exploitative. But I think it's a boring answer, but true alignment matters when everyone is working with the same facts. They're hearing from each other, and we're not taking credit for anything the advisors are doing. We're not here to give that narrow advice. We're here to make sure that it all does sync up, and all the recipe, all the ingredients equal an outcome where at least the family know or feel comfortable with the consequences they're getting into.
So kind of looking at the beginning steps then of this, when you're first getting involved in a family or you're taking on a new family office, what would be, let's say, the first 3 things that you assess?
The first 3 things that I'd assess when taking on or starting a family office, so with the family themselves, is who has authority, who thinks they have authority, and where do those 2 things sort of diverge. The first thing is really decision making. Then the next thing is information quality. Where do the reports exist? Are they trusted? How often are they produced? Can anyone genuinely see the full picture yet across several entities, assets, liabilities, advisors, obligations? Then what's being missed? The amount of, here's a very low hanging fruit one, but the amount of incredibly ultra high net worth wealthy individuals I speak to that don't have a will you would be alarmed. What is being missed, what is being dependent on one person's memory. I did a handover recently for a family, and their former advisor was giving me a lot of information, and I asked, where have you got it written down? Do you have a family Bible? And he just sort of went, no, it's all up here. I was like, that's terrible. It's so bad. It's so bad. We have to create an ecosystem where it's not dependent on an individual, that it can survive once I'm gone, once the next person's gone. But yeah, those would sort of be the formation of finding out what is the operating truth for the family office that we're about to create.
Do you find it easier to create an entire new family office or to go in and fix a broken one like that?
I think when you're building one from scratch, there's usually sort of you're coming with a blank sheet of paper and a degree of optimism, right? When you're fixing something that's broken, it's usually harder because you're not just designing a system, but you're unwinding bad habits, and so you're not just solving technical problems, but you're kind of having to rebuild trust, and so things can be organized properly. Because for ultra high net worth people, the families, they do need to trust you. They don't have the capacity to do it all on their own. They also might not want to do it on their own. They want to focus on more wealth generation. They want to focus on enjoying their wealth. Building one is architecture. Fixing one is, you're kind of going hunting and treasure hunting, but with politics involved. So, and that's always going to be a little bit slower, but it can be quite rewarding from an advisory point of view to go in and tidy up a mess.
Yeah. And what signals would you say you have to tell you that a family office has outgrown its original structure?
What signals for a family office that it's outgrown its original structure? I think complexity. When complexity starts being managed informally and casually, that's when I think that's a strong indicator that this structure is no longer working. A classic sign would be dependence on one or two individuals, reporting that's no longer joined up, advisors working out that coordination. I think a family office has outgrown its structure when there's almost like a muscle memory doing the work rather than governance is in place. And that's when models stop being clean and lean and start becoming dangerously underbuilt. And I see that a lot, because it's getting too much for one person. And in fact, you don't need 15, 20 people in your family office, but you might need a core two or three. When I was running a family office that was in the Valley of the Billions, there were two or three primary advisors, that would be coordinating, quite serious expenditure.
And at what point would you say a wealthy individual needs to make that transition into a formal family office unit?
Usually a lot earlier than they probably realize. I mean, people often assume a family office is triggered by an exit event, a specific wealth number, like a moment. But I think I think that's the wrong test. I think the real trigger is, as I've always said, is complexity. I've met some very wealthy individuals. There is no complexity, and they're worth hundreds of millions, if not billions, for some of these families. There's no complexity. They don't require a family office. But when you start getting complex with multiple private investments, multiple advisors, multiple jurisdictions, multiple property, multiple businesses, multiple philanthropic activities, staff, or just family governance issues, which I think is a big one, your complexity leads to a coordination problem, which whether you call it a family office or not. I spoke at this event once and someone said, rich people have family offices. And I said, I don't think family office is a badge for the ultra rich. I think it's a response to complexity that's growing. That's why you require it. And it's called a family office because essentially at the heart of it, at its DNA, it is revolving around a family and how they're going to access this wealth now, the next generation, and generations to come.
Yeah. And speaking of kind of generations to come and the future of the industry, you've described the sector as booming. What does the next decade of multifamily offices look like?
I think it's going to be exciting. I think, we are getting more wealth being created in ways that we didn't expect before. Before it was traditionally investment bankers and entrepreneurs. But the reality is, you're getting athletes and entertainers that are generating some extraordinary wealth, and not through an X event. They're literally making it every month. You've got content creators that are entering the space. They're making some extraordinary money. So I think it's exciting because there's more opportunity. I think it's going to get more professional. I think it's going to get more specialized. I think it's going to be far less willing to pretend it's some sort of loose coordination. I think clients will also be more discerning. They'll ask tougher questions about independence and capability. They'll want someone who's actually run complexity across multiple borders and multiple disciplines. So I think the future of the industry belongs to those who have got a proven track record on it, rather than which I see a lot in some other areas where people are relying on their friends or their family to help them. And as I told someone recently, your dad isn't an ex-lawyer or an ex-accountant who can advise on this. He's going to miss some nuance. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is you can't fire your dad. So that's why it's important for us to be there and advising those family members.
And just to kind of finish off, we ask all of our guests this: if there's one thing that you would like people to take away from this conversation today, what would you like them to remember?
Well, I think wealth uh, doesn't eliminate problems of vulnerability. It just changes how you're being attacked. I think extreme wealth doesn't remove fragility. Very often, all it does is it professionalizes it. I tell people all the time that if you won, none of us, probably listening to this podcast are 100 millionaires or billionaires. Maybe we might be advisors to those people. But I tell people all the time that there's a journey where people have some sort of exit event or they have some sort of wealth defining event. And the first thing is that they're really excited. They've got enough money where they don't have to do anything ever again if they didn't want to. But very quickly they realize, and this would happen to you or anyone listening or watching, that if you won the Euro Millions for 180 million, you're going to be excited. But then you're going to realize that people are going to feel entitled to ask you for money, right? So me asking you for £5, if I see you next week, Kate, for lunch and say, can I have £5? You're going to give me £5. You can afford to give me £5. But if you scale that up to you've won 500 million on the Euro Millions and I ask you for 50,000, it's probably, from a quantum perspective, it's not a lot of money now because you've got 500 million in the bank. The problem is though, that is the attitude of feeling like I could just ask it for you. You've now become the bank of wealth. You've become the bank of Kate. And the problem with that is that a lot of people feel that way. So you've got people coming, and you've not just got extended family, you've got strangers, you've got friends who are going to come and try to suckle from the teat and asking for money. And there's a pain there in realizing that while the wealth brings a degree of freedom, different stresses come about because you are going to be viewed more predatory than you ever have before. And people are going to become with their hat in hand. They're going to be coming with sales pitches. So I wouldn't encourage anyone necessarily go to the opposite end and be super discreet, but it does show why you need to have a regimented structure in place to avoid exploitation, to avoid being the bad guy. And if you look, at various sort of, high-level celebrity examples, Ryan Reynolds and his wife were eventually, I think, blackmailed because they had a friend who they just kept giving money, and a reporter once asked them, well, I mean, you're rich. Couldn't you just keep giving him 10 grand a month? And I thought the answer was very good. I'm going to sort of paraphrase here, but Ryan said, at some point, we've got to stop writing checks, and he's right. We're not here to look after everyone. And there's a difference between being kind and helping each other out versus, well, now you're my source of income and I can just live whatever life I want. There's a difference between giving someone assistance and giving someone much needed empathy and help versus you become the bank of, whoever, Bank of Kate, and just you're basically funding everyone to you're drained of all your resources, where perhaps you could make more dynamic changes. So I think there's a different type of fragility that comes along with extreme wealth, and it's a very high level poor me problem to have, but it is something that I think a lot of people underestimate about families, especially families like I work with who are in the public eye. There's a whole different level of stress that comes with that.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay. Well, thank you so much, John. That was so helpful and so interesting to hear your insights. And thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.